Chia?
Oh, yeah, I'm fine now. Oh, I'm really sorry, Mr. Carlo. I was unmute and that means just leave that for me to unmute myself. The internet connection is not so good from my side. I hope everything is okay during this an hour.
Is your audio is better now as compared earlier? I think we should be fine.
Yeah. I think we shall start in 4-5 minutes. Sorry, apology, Mr. Carlo. I would like to pronounce your name correctly. Is it Carlo Ebo or
Yes, Carlo Ibeo.
or ABL? Yeah.
Ibeo, yes.
Dr. Anna, I'm Sochia. Just call me Sochia. Is fine.
Sochia.
Yeah. Dr. Anna. You're very pleased to see you. I have been following you for many years.
You're too kind.
Dr. Anna specialized or Lee or Lai?
Spenceley.
Oh, Spenceley. Spenceley. Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. Thank you. Dr. Ben, may I call you like Dr. Benjamin Ian Quinto? Is it correct?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. I think I have a brief introduction on ecotourism just before hand on to the first speaker, Mr. Carlo. But as I mentioned in our conversation that we are going to have like around roughly a little bit more or less around 15 minutes. I'm going to give a sign 2 minutes before your time is up. Yeah. Okay. Right. Side by side and okay. Yeah. Hello, Karen. Just to check, we do not hear any sound from you. Is it okay that we start the session for now? Or you jump in to share that slide for us? Okay, I think I think we shall start the session for this very interesting discussion session on ecotourism, and we would like to thank you for your times, and this is just to say distinguished guests, speakers, and gentle ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, and welcome to our conference on ICRTH 2021. My name is Nham Sochia. I am currently a lecturer and researcher at the Department of Tourism at Royal University of Phnom Penh, and I am a chair speaker for this session on ecotourism and responsible actions. I am so happy to see all of you here. We have roughly for now around 50 participants and delegates who are eager to engage and specifically in discussion and hearing insightful and expert comment from our distinguished guest speakers on ecotourism in rebuilding ecotourism for future through sustainable tourism. Initially, a brief background of ecotourism, as we can see, the trends of ecotourism started around 1980s, especially after the growth of critique of mass tourism. You can see the shift of alternative toward more responsible tourism, and ecotourism is gaining momentum and more attention. At a very pragmatic level, we also see ecotourism has been paying attention on for conservation and development, especially for livelihood developments. And we can see ecotourism is becoming embedded into the agenda among donors, development partners, and global, regional, or national level in many different parts of the world. As you can see in our speaker presentation, covering some area like Asian America or some part and many parts of African regions. We can hear a lot of the conversation this morning, especially under the theme of impact, response, and recoveries. And this is one of the prevalent discussion by our guest speaker in this discussion as well. As the global pandemics, one of the important part for response and recovery is to promote domestic tourism, which bind very strongly with ecotourism as one of the most important tools and priorities among many governments in the regions. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Mr. Carlo Ebelos, who is our very special guest from the Philippines, and he's talking about sustainable cultural-based tourism practices in the times of pandemics. Very brief introduction from Mr. Carlo. He has many leadership and management position as a vice president in South Cotabao Province Tourism Council, and he's also a vice chairman at the cities of Coronadal Cultural and Arts Councils. And he's also a vice head of National Commission for Culture and Art and a board trustee or president appointee at National Museums of the Philippines. Mr. Carlo is an award-winning scholar, and he has been engaging and working to advocate on cultural aspects, a lot of things about governance, and he also a fellow researcher and visiting professor in art of cultures, Asian and in the region, and also across part of the project from Europe. This is a brief bit, and Mr. Carlo is a specialist in the part of cultures. And without further ado, please everyone help me to welcome Mr. Carlo Ebeos. And then the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suchia. Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me in this Zoom platform on the conference on rebuilding tourism for the future through sustainable development. I'd like to share my presentation. There you go. The title of my presentation is Moving Forward. This is our initiatives on culture-based tourism in the countries, and most of what I'm going to share later on are my experience as head of projects and head of different organizations in the Philippines. Let me begin by the premise that our cultural and natural heritage is the backbone of the tourism and hospitality industry. Whether we are in ecotourism or wellness tourism, culture is the backbone. And secondly, I'd like to say that I'd like to the construct that resiliency in times of disaster is tantamount to respond on the ongoing disaster or the pandemic, for example. We need to do a recovery plan and prepare for other disasters as well, because disasters such as pandemic is just but one, and there are many other disasters in the future. Just a quick background of what happened last year. We had a lot of experience, but in the Philippines, especially in my city, we were panicking. Our government was so indecisive. Our communities are very unprepared. There's a lot of fear. A lot of people are thinking it's the end of the world. We are a Christian country in the Philippines. And because we believe in the Antichrist, the second coming of Christ and all these things, and the more that a lot of these belief systems are ingrained in us, the more that we have a lot of mixed sentiments and mixed emotions, even a lot of anti-government sentiments as well. But there's few people who actually made some initiatives, and I started a movement in my city called Bulig Contra COVID. Bulig means help. It's help for people against COVID. No? Our mission then and now is to serve the needs of the frontliners, our doctors, our checkpoints, our men in uniform, our government people. No? We would like to facilitate the efficient delivery of donations coming from the private sector. We coordinated with the local government, ensuring that the donors, the people will understand the different policies. We have facilitated services in connecting with the private sector. At the same time, we committed to assist in building a platform where community will be able to understand the different policies, because it seems that the policies of the government are not so congruent with each other. And at the same time, I was also working with affiliated with a lot of national agencies. We addresses problems by giving cash allowances to our sector, the cultural sector. But then those were not concrete. Those were not concrete examples. And what we have experiencing now is that we need more of, we need to plan more. And then last year, a lot of sites emerged. A lot of destination sites emerged. And there were a lot of sporadic activities as well that are not coordinated. And some of the policies for these ecotourism sites were acted due to fear. And when the local government organized staff, especially the tourism sector, they are not so strategic and not so long-term. A lot of protocols are even violated. Even look at those in the picture, no? Lack of policies, and we are so unprepared for this new site. And now another issues on mental health is rising. So there's a lot of these kinds of things that are happening now. Recently, the cultural sector responded by coming up with a cultural response and resiliency plan. This is an 8-year program crafted by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, wherein the plan is actually a toolkit that will address sectoral and thematic planning, wherein characteristics such as addressing or approaching culture as practitioners, such as artists. So there were like FGDs or focus group discussions for managers and workers, because in the Philippines, the cultural sector is in the bottom of the line. And at the same time, we addresses communities to speak, and we had consultations with indigenous peoples, the Moro communities, and the general public that supports these initiatives. And all this are towards, in one year or the other, affects the tourism industry in the country. The program the framework is utilizing the guidelines from our disaster risk reduction mitigation management programs in the Philippines. No? In this diagram here, it illustrates the planning themes that correspond to the phases of the disaster. No? Wherein we wanted to respond to COVID-19 because of the ongoing disaster. So by creating programs and activities, we wanted also to carve plans and programs for the recovery as post-disaster, and we wanted to prepare as well ourselves for all disasters that might happen in the country in the future. So it's a spiraling and continuum process. The model is supported by the different KRA, just like any other planning tool. No? It has outcomes, it has indicators, it has lead agencies, it has implementers, no? It has stakeholders, initiatives and strategies, as well as timeline. And that program, that tool is the one guiding us in the commission now in creating our programs for 2021 and 2022. One of our programs is called Balag and Tukod. Balag means a tool that is a planting tool, and it addresses issues on food security, sustainability, and all. And I'd like also to share our experience in the municipality here in the province, which I'm part with. And this is also, and I'd like to share one program that I'm currently heading, which is we're establishing community libraries. The Balag and Tukod program of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts is a program that responds to the recommendation of the Philippine Development Plan. What we wanted to aim is how cultural education and culturally inherent social capital and other forms of cooperations are harnessed and utilized as framing in production system. Because when we engage with conservation and promotion of our heritage and food, for example, then we are indirectly impacting the tourism industry as a resource generation. This is the picture of what we're doing. We are doing webinar sessions for edible gardening. We have a webinar as well called Voices from the Field, wherein we engage with a lot of practitioners doing plant-based tie-dyeing practices, for fabrics, and a lot of planting and vegetable gardening. We are also promoting and helping communities reviving and sustaining their traditional upland rice, and as well as gardens and other stuff. No, this leads to food production and sustaining food manufacturing practices, for example. And at the same time, we also addresses problems on heritage conservation, such as that of the traditional houses. At the same time, we are helping teachers concretizing food technology and other heritage, that will be subsumed and incorporated in building their modules. Because at the moment, we in the Department of Education in the Philippines are integrating and developing modules instead of the face-to-face teaching strategies. So this is the phase of what we're doing for the Balaging Tukod. One of the activities as well and programs that the municipalities, the local governments are doing now is creating profiles or mapping our heritage program in the different municipalities, such as in Colombio. This is in the province of Sultan Kudarat. We wanted to create a compendium of our cultural heritage. We wanted to document it so that the data that will be gathered are very useful in developing programs for local tourism development and promotions and many other things. This is what I'm doing now. I'm employed at the National Book Development Board. The Book Nook is an initiative of our organization that we provide Filipino authored and published books through a setup of safe and friendly reading spaces in different parts of the country. The space serves as resource center and an added feature for locals, where we can create our stories about the Philippines in the world. Currently, the Nook provides books as a resource because we wanted to engage the different communities. We wanted them to connect, and we wanted to empower them. Most of these communities are actually the vulnerable sector communities, such as the indigenous peoples, the Moro communities, and all. And we are currently setting up 52 book nook sites in the Philippines, where art-making activities such as storytelling sessions, especially right now that the problems in mental health issues is arising. We have dramatic readings, we have drawings and sketches for children, and for government people, we do capacity building programs, on-site programming, by providing them books with best practices on tourism, DRRM or disaster risk management, even social, business, or even mental health. We also have programs on food and culinary in the sites. At the same time, we have resources on ritual interactions and other intangible heritage plans and programs on conservation, tourism, livelihood. Going back to the CRRP or the Cultural Response and Resiliency Program or plan, when the plan was made, there were various rapid assessment that were conducted. I have listed some examples from the data that was gathered, and it was divided into 3 sections. One is the aspiration sector as part of the recommendation, as well as policy and the policies for other stakeholders who wanted to be involved. I've highlighted the preservation in terms of one of the medium to long-term aspiration of the sector. The cultural sector is we wanted to preserve, protect, and revitalize our natural heritage resource for sustainable development on tourism, livelihood, and other purposes. We wanted to intensify that as much as we have agencies doing that, but now there seems to be a lack of coordination within our systems, within our commissions, our agencies in the local government on intensifying the preservation of our cultural heritage. And
Excuse me, Carlo, you still have some time left. Right. You still have 2 minutes. Thank you.
2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Then we also have policy recommendations for continued research and our creative economy to promote our cultural industry. So because promoting our creative industry is a vital for our tourism industry, and a lot of recommendations as well were carved for public-private partnership in heritage tourism, partnership for preservation and heritage sites and spaces, and all. Lastly, addressing the needs and concerns of the cultural sector equals responsible tourism and hospitality. I still have a minute, right? I'd like to share our own story. This is my family story. In 2008, we have a restaurant.
Yes,
and,
yes, please.
We have a restaurant, and we hardly make from it. We're like that documentary in Netflix, that there's a program that revives and rehabilitates restaurants who are failing. In 2015, we rebranded, made some fiscal improvements and all, but we were okay then, as our sales were on a break even. In 2020, when we started the task force bully contra COVID, we volunteered our restaurant as a community kitchen. I helped set up mobile market and all, but we also invested in online marketing, online applications, on food delivery. We hired IT people and made our online platform better and very visible in the web. As a result, it was an overnight success. In terms of revenues, we quadrupled our revenues, and now we can hire more people. This is what we learned so far, that entrepreneurship is all about service to community. Responsible tourism and hospitality means responsible business owners who are willing to share. And in times of disaster, your business is a shared opportunity. Thank you very much. Terima kasih. Sukran. Salamat po. This ends my presentation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Carlo, for your insightful presentation and very interesting case from the Philippines, and a lot of achievement despite of the very difficult challenge we face at this moment. Next, I would like to, we are very honored to have Dr. Anna Specialist with us for this session, for this very important session. And I think Dr. Anna Specialist is a big name in the academy and the industry, but for consistency reason, I would like to introduce briefly about Dr. Anna to all of you. Dr. Anna is an independent consultant who works on sustainable tourism, many, for example, EU, UNESCO, and UNEP, and so on and so forth. She has collected a lot of publications and newspapers and many other materials published on COVID-19. In her, she has published very, very important book. Everyone's very, very interested to read this one. Is on everyone, please join me to
Great, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Yeah, my name is Anna Spenceley. I'm joining you from Papua New Guinea today. And as a bit of background, I chair the WCPA's Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group. and sit on the board of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. And I'd like to really thank Professor Ting for inviting me to participate in this meeting, and also thanks to Sakia for facilitating this session. So these are the issues I'll be speaking about today, starting with a quick recap on how tourism used to be. So prior to the pandemic, researchers estimated that the world's protected areas received around 8 billion visits a year, and they generated around $600 billion per year in direct in-country expenditure. Nearly 22 million jobs are supported worldwide by wildlife tourism. And we know that money from tourism can help redistribute wealth through value chains from tourists to people living in around protected areas, for example, through spending on transport, accommodation, excursions, shopping, and on food and drink. But now we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really changed everything. So the UNWTO has reported that between January and May 2020, 100% of global destinations imposed travel restrictions due to COVID-19. And the impact of these restrictions on the number of international arrivals has been dramatic. Furthermore, the implications for tourism destinations in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals have been varied and highly complex. And there have been literally hundreds of media releases and opinion pieces and articles about how the pandemic is affecting nature-based tourism and ecotourism, wildlife tourism, and businesses and livelihoods. And I've collected as many as I can of these and put them on this blog post, which you can see the link here. We've seen destinations that had suffered from overcrowding and over-tourism in the past were suddenly empty. And protected areas across the world have been closed in many countries, and visitation from international arrivals particularly declined dramatically. And these closures have had a major impact on cash flow, where nature-based tourism had been a key revenue generator. And this has affected the protected area revenues and also money being spent in gateway communities. To illustrate, if you look at compare an economic analysis of tourism contributions that took place in 2018, the reduction by 50% in visitation due to park closures in Brazil has been estimated to generate a loss of 55,000 permanent or temporary jobs, and a reduction of $575 million in GDP. And the financial losses for community and private conservancies have been particularly devastating. The Old Kenya Conservancy in Kenya, for example, agreed to pay only half of the usual rent to the Maasai pastoralists, as they would have to back pay deposits to international tourists who cancelled their trips. And these rental fees are usually paid in exchange for not settling or grazing livestock in the conservancies. And usually each landowner would earn about $220 per month this way. So there are real fears that the uncertainty over tourism recovery might lead community conservancies to sell their land or convert wildlife habitats to agriculture, cattle ranching, or charcoal production. So we can take a closer look at the impacts in Africa that have been observed. One of my consultancy assignments has been on behalf of the EU, and I undertook a survey to better understand the impact of the pandemic on nature-based tourism in protected areas, and particularly looking at the impacts on conservation, businesses, and communities. For Africa, there were 736 responses that came from accommodations, tour operators, activities, experience providers, restaurant and bar services, and also hunting operations. And on average, 3/4 of their customers were normally international clients. So not surprisingly, there were huge reductions in their customers. And on average, there were 63% fewer customers when the survey took place, while the number of future booking requests also was down by about 72%. There was also a massive number of cancellations from March to June 2020, 83% on average. And in response to the challenges, nearly all of the operators implemented measures to mitigate the impacts. The majority offered customers the options to reschedule their trip or change their cancellation refund policies. However, many were forced to close their facilities temporarily, and 2% at this stage had to close permanently. More than half of the employees of these operators recruited locally, meaning within 50 kilometers. But by June 2020, most local staff were on reduced wages. More than half had put some local staff on leave without pay. And again, nearly half had made redundancy. And it was predicted that if the crisis were to continue, over 17,000 local employees working for just these tourism operators would have been adversely and directly affected. affected. Furthermore, 80% of the operators said that environmental crime was one of their most important and immediate concerns. And compounding this prediction was the change in their own expenditure on payments for environmental services. And in terms of expenditure on security and anti-poaching, they predicted that they would have cumulatively $25 million less spending on these things locally. As for the actual impacts on wildlife, it's difficult to say conclusively the impact yet. It appears that in some places there have been lower incidents of wildlife crime because poachers can't move themselves or the wildlife products around so easily, while in other locations there have been upsurges in poaching. In some areas there have also been concerns because of the lack of tourists, and with their additional eyes have previously contributed to reducing wildlife crime. And there have also been reports of wildlife reclaiming areas that became bereft of tourists. And this has made us rethink whether we were really implementing the principles of sustainable tourism properly in destinations. So now let's look at some of the recovery trends. With the advent of vaccines and PCR tests, travel restrictions have begun to ease globally, and there are signs of travel passports in the future too. Protected areas are reopening gradually and cautiously for different types of tourists or tourist activities to account for COVID conditions. Compared to the map I showed earlier, you can see that many more countries here are now green rather than purple, indicating increased visitation. But protected areas themselves are taking vastly different approaches to tourism recovery. For example, in Machu Picchu in Peru, the park reopened after an 8-month closure, but the World Heritage Site will now only permit 675 visitors a day, which is around 30% of its previous capacity. And by contrast, in Indonesia, the government plans to establish a multi-million-dollar infrastructure development, which has locals concerned about the impact on the wildlife in the World Heritage Site. A recent editorial essay from the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas emphasized the importance of protected and conserved areas in sustaining our physical and mental health, particularly under the stress of COVID-19. And indeed, TripAdvisor's market analysis suggests that natural destinations are likely to be early beneficiaries of demand. But in our rush to escape lockdown and get back outside, the resurgence has also seen drawbacks and a return to over-tourism. There are places where protected area managers have not been prepared to manage a huge influx of new cohorts of visitors. And these visitors have left waste behind them, including single-use plastics and disposable protective equipment like face masks. Furthermore, residents in many gateway communities and living in neighboring protected areas face a dilemma. On one hand, they want tourists to return so they can recover their businesses and the jobs that are supporting tourism. But on the other hand, they're scared that visitors will bring the virus with them. And this is particularly concerning where there are healthcare facilities in developing countries are limited, and also where the rollout of the vaccine has also been limited so far. Furthermore, while there's a desire to build back better amongst many, there are concerned that the industry will simply go back to business as usual and miss an opportunity to transform into a more sustainable and resilient sector. Recognizing the impacts that have taken place during COVID-19 and the challenges with nature, pollution, and climate, many think pieces this year and last year focused on building back better and greener. So what is the way forward and what can we do? Well, I think that we can help by continuing to provide more guidance to protected area managers and tourism operators. For example, the EU will shortly release this report on tourism and visitation to protected areas amid COVID-19, which will be translated into 6 languages. But one of the gaps that I'm concerned about for ecotourism relates to wildlife-tourist interactions and how to avoid transmission of this zoonotic disease and future zoonotic diseases, and how we adjust animal welfare guidelines for tourism operators. We need to share more ideas and examples that will guide destinations and the tourism sector towards better practices. Materials can be made accessible through reports and social media posts, and by continuing to use webinars and online meetings like this one to share thoughts and insights from across the world. We need to reinforce messaging about sustainable tourism and ecotourism, recognizing the difficulties of operating tourism at all at this time, sustainably or otherwise, when conditions and restrictions are changing so rapidly. There really is a wealth of information out there produced by many agencies that can be of help, and it can be linked to training and mentoring programs. funding also needs to be sourced to sustain destinations, companies, and livelihoods. Many countries have developed rescue packages to support the tourism sector during the crisis, and there have been international grants and technical support initiatives too. However, some of the emergency grant programs have been flooded with applications that cannot all be supported, and crowdfunding programs only generate limited amounts of money. So there's a real need for options for emergency relief and longer-term systemic changes to conservation finance to be sought. I also think that strategically for the tourism sector, we need to think again about how we want to measure success. And again, stress moving away from looking at the number of visitors and rather towards the measurement of various sustainability criteria. Furthermore, we can really expand and reinforce partnerships that use the power of coalitions and cooperation that push for responsible recovery. For example, the Tapas Group has been recently supporting the development of a new tourism action coalition for sustainable ocean, which was launched yesterday. I think that the energy and drive across government, private sector, and civil society really make me optimistic that there's impetus to build back better and greener. So in closing, I'd just like to introduce to you a copy of a book which I just finished editing, which was just published by Edward Elgar. And I hope that this will, and all the contributions by all the authors, will help us in a sustainable recovery. Please get in touch if you're interested. And thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Is Sokia there?
Yeah, I can't see him. So maybe I should just start talking.
Maybe that's a good idea.
And
share your screen.
give Sokia a time to fix the connection. All right. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? My slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. All right. Okay, well, so I'm a tourism geographer from Australia, now based at the University of Hong Kong. Much of my research has looked at the relationship between backpackers and the environment, and between backpackers and sustainability, focusing on backpacker practices. So I'm less interested in attitudes and beliefs, and I'm more interested in what people are actually doing as backpackers on a day-to-day basis. And when I have presented this research, I'm often asked about ecotourism. And yet studies that explicitly link backpackers with ecotourists are quite rare. Even though you can take eco tours as part of backpacking trips, and many ecotourists would of course have backpacking experiences. So today what I'm going to do is explore some of the connections between ecotourism and backpacker tourism. There are some important similarities, but there are also significant differences, which I hope to draw out both of those. In 2016, I completed a PhD at the University of Melbourne, in which I investigated the relationship between backpackers and sustainability. I spent a few months as part of my fieldwork traveling around Australia, living as a backpacker, staying in hostels, doing interviews with backpackers. And what my research was able to show was that backpackers performed a whole range of sustainable practices, but they didn't care about sustainability. They didn't care about the environment. It really wasn't something that they were consciously interested in. They were performing sustainable practices inadvertently, unintentionally, because this was just what was required of them to be backpackers. It was the backpacking context that induced them. And there are a lot of examples. I'll give you a few of them. So for example, backpackers tolerated old bed sheets and pillows and towels and crockery and cooking utensils. So hostel owners were not constantly replacing these items. It reduces the amount of waste going to landfill. It reduces the amount of resources that are used in the manufacturing process, the transportation of these items. Backpackers also usually traveled overland in buses or cars rather than flying. Every sustainability research will be telling us we have to fly less, we have to carpool more, that sort of thing. Backpackers were just doing that not because they cared about the environment, but because it was cheaper, and they would do it over very long distances. 19-hour bus rides were common. And during fieldwork, I drove with 2 other backpackers in a camper van from Alice Springs to Cairns, which is a distance of around 2,500 kilometers. We didn't rent the van either. We were relocating it on behalf of the rental company because it was cheaper for us. So it cost 217 Australian dollars for 5 days per person. So that's around $43 per day for food, fuel, and accommodation, which is quite a low per day spending as a tourist, but backpackers are low budget tourists. And of course, we had to spend a lot of time driving, but that was exciting. We got to see parts of the country that most people and most tourists do not. And relocations are particularly sustainable because what we did was collect all of the items that were left over by the tourists who were using the camper van prior to us. So we got an onion, we got detergent, we got tissues, we got 20 liters of water. So there's not many tourists who would voluntarily reduce their resource consumption for long periods of time. There's not many that would be excited about getting a free onion. So backpackers, they do that voluntarily. They reduce their material standards of living for long periods of time while still being able to enjoy a relatively good life. And to be clear, in order to deal with climate change, people in the developed world are going to have to accept lower standards of living. So this is something we're going to have to learn to do long term. Now let's talk about ecotourists. So ecotourists also have much to teach us about achieving sustainability, both in tourism contexts and across other spheres of everyday life. Ecotourists are interested in environmental learning, and we're going to need a lot more everyday environmental knowledge as the climate becomes more and more unpredictable. Some ecotourists also participate in environmental restoration projects, such as bushfire recovery in Australia. And again, with climate change, that's going to be another thing that we're going to have to do more often. Ecotourists are also interested in sustaining the cultural well-being of the people receiving them into their communities. And there's a tendency, unfortunately, I think there's a tendency to see culture as being separate from nature with much of these tourism initiatives. But in reality, they're deeply integrated. Culture informs humanity's relationships with the environment at the same time the environment informs culture, which is obvious when you think about the word agriculture or horticulture, but they're often conceptually held apart, I think, with real consequences for environmental action. Tourism also has its own understandings of the environment and about how tourists connect with it. For backpackers, the environment is more than a backdrop or a beautiful view, although they are important too. This is Lake Mackenzie on Fraser Island in Southeast Australia. The environment helps to sustain backpacker identity, but not in the way that the ocean would obviously sustain a surfing tourist identity. It's got more to do with the ability to distinguish yourself from conventional mass tourists via experiencing hardships. The hot air and dust blowing through the windows of a local bus, the water that's splashing onto you into the small sampan that you're riding in on your way to an outlying island. When I remember my own experiences as a backpacker in Australia, in Asia, in Africa, the environment was not always a pleasant one. It was usually hot and sweaty. It was usually uncomfortable, but we didn't want to travel in luxury. Backpacking emphasizes social interactions with local people, And traveling like the locals do is, one way to achieve that. I can remember crossing the border from Mozambique into South Africa on a local bus, and we all cheered when two of the passengers crossed over the border without passports. And the environment plays a different role in ecotourism. It's obviously part of the product sold by the ecotourism industry, but it's also something that ecotourists consciously, they want to learn about, protect, and manage in a sustainable way. And what I like in the way ecotourists relate to the environment is that it's not always something to passively photograph or gaze upon. It's more likely something quite active, whether it's about kayaking or working on restoration projects. Your whole body is involved in the environment when you're an ecotourist. And this is what it means to integrate culture and nature in practice. One of the hard things about being environmentally aware as a tourist is that you notice all the damage. And as a sustainable tourism researcher, it's something that I encounter all the time, or at least before COVID when I was able to travel. Everyone else is enjoying the view, but all I can see is the bleached coral or the absence of fish or the empty habitat. And I can remember snorkeling in Vietnam, close to the coast amongst the rocks, and there was no fish. The habitat felt like being in an abandoned building or something like that. It was quite a sad feeling. You would think that there'd be a lot of animals around in that type of environment, but there wasn't. So you notice the damage a lot more when you have that awareness. And there's good things about that. There's also bad things too. Okay, so now let's look at the similarities between these two forms of tourism. Researchers found that backpackers have a stake in limiting or preventing development because they prefer to avoid massive resort-style tourism. The bungalow on the beach is more their style, and they usually don't have the budget for hotel accommodation. As some researchers have said, this makes them natural allies with local communities who are interested in retaining local control over development in their regions. It's much easier for local communities to retain control over low-scale development than massive resorts or high-rise hotels, which are usually controlled by corporate interests. But I would say it also makes backpackers natural allies with ecotourists who are also interested in reducing overdevelopment for environmental reasons. Ecotourism relies on a healthy environment. And if you remove reefs to enable large cruise ships to dock or replace mangroves with the beach, it'll be less appealing. And personally, I would prefer that we didn't have to put a price on the environment in order to prevent its destruction, because it has value for its own sake, but also because the economic value is often understated, I think. The amount of erosion that's prevented by mangroves, for example, it's hard to put into dollar terms because that benefit is persisting across dozens of human generations. So it's effectively priceless. But ecotourism, like backpacking, is not always anti-development. So both are attracted to off the beaten track destinations, and as such, they can both trigger development in places with fragile environments. Backpackers were the first tourists to visit places like Koh Samui and Bali, and now they're mass tourism destinations. In Western Australia, a mining billionaire has proposed a luxury ecotourism resort on the Ningaloo Reef, which will, of course, disturb habitats and have a substantial environmental impact. Research on backpackers to Fraser Island in Eastern Australia found that backpackers were not environmentally conscious or interested in conservation. They considered themselves short-term visitors where anything goes. And I found a similar thing in my research as well. I did some field work on Fraser Island. And another study recommended marketing ecotourism products and promoting environmental education to backpackers before they went on holiday. And this was because the authors found that their environmental concern would wane once they were away from home. So in many cases, backpackers and ecotourists are both interested in environmental conservation only so far as to maximize their tourism experiences. And not far from Ningaloo Reef, there are plans to develop a industrial deep water port to support offshore oil and gas mining. And it's really interesting because the ecotourism resort is owned by a mining billionaire. So it's hard to believe these two projects are completely unrelated. Ecotourism is normally portrayed as a way to prevent development projects such as mining. And in many cases, it can do just that. But if this ecotourism resort is funded by money earned from mining, it's kind of harder to separate those two industries. Okay, let's look at some of the differences between these two forms of tourism. While it's true that backpackers and ecotourists can both help to lower the environmental impact of tourism, they do so for different reasons. Sustainability or sustainable management is often part of the ecotourism product. Backpackers, on the other hand, don't care about sustainability, even though they perform many so-called sustainable practices like carpooling or taking public transport. Both ecotourists and backpackers would prefer local communities to retain control over tourism in their regions, but for different reasons. For ecotourists, local control would limit overdevelopment and thus sustain the environments that they pay good money to experience. For backpackers, overdevelopment would lead to upscale resorts and forms of hotel accommodation that they can't afford. Local communities retaining control would make it more likely some budget accommodation would still be available. And ecotourism is also more specific than backpacking. There's a much more narrow range of activities that count as ecotourism. It has to be nature-based to some extent. There is usually some environmental knowledge being shared with ecotourists, but backpacking is very diverse. It's low-budget independent tourism. It doesn't have to be nature-based. You don't have to gain environmental knowledge or indeed any type of knowledge to be a backpacker. There's also a journal of ecotourism, but there's no journal of backpacking. And what you can read into that is that ecotourism is probably more formalized as an area of interest, an area of research, an area of industry concern than backpacking. Okay, so to conclude, who's more sustainable? Ecotourists don't inadvertently perform sustainability practices, while backpackers don't care about the environment. However, backpackers are able to live happily with reduced levels of resource consumption for long periods of time, which is exactly what we'll need to do if we're going to take climate change and the environmental crisis seriously. Ecotourists can go to luxury resorts that require substantial forms of development. And it's overconsumption that has played a massive role getting us into this, the mess that we're in globally. Ecotourists are more environmentally aware, I would say, than backpackers. But ecotourism, it's too niche. Backpacking has more to teach us about sustainable living in general. And therefore, I'd say that backpacking is more sustainable overall. But it is definitely a hard call and can be debated, but that's my view. Thank you very much. This is the end of my talk.
Hi again, everyone, and my apology, everyone, for disconnecting off and on due to my internet connection is very, very bad today. Actually, I'm cut off from the presentation, but I discuss and read the presentation for the preparation reason. And again, back to all the speaker question, comment and insightful presentation point raised. I think we have some question in the chat box, but unfortunately, because I was discussing, I could not see all the question here. But one of the question that initially raised by friends is also discussing about the pandemics. This is just one, but there probably be many others. In this context, like presentation covered by Dr. Anna, especially cover very precisely about the impacts, recovery and response and recovery, and also maybe we can learn about the resilience build on the case from Mr. Carlo, a very interesting case from the Philippines. So this is very interesting discussion, but because of the time limitation, we probably do not have much to accommodate all the questions, but maybe I the question for all the speakers, based specifically on ecotourism. This is a strong emphasis on many governments in the regions, putting ecotourism as emphasis for link with domestic tourism as a priority for response and recovery. What is your insightful comment, further insightful comment? What do you see this as the way forward for recovery, for adapting or backbone to the pandemic, and especially, please.
I'm sorry, Sakia, the line wasn't very good. Could you repeat the question, please?
We heard a lot about the recovery strategy by putting an emphasis on domestic tourism, and then link with ecotourism as a very good complement. So what is your thought about putting a priority on ecotourism as the way forward for recovery, for backbone from the pandemic?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think certainly ecotourism can be used as part of the recovery strategy because of its very nature to be usually in open natural spaces, the opportunities for social distancing and dispersing visitors so that there's less chance of transmitting COVID-19 is high. And I think there needs to be support for destination and protected area managers to help them with strategies to disperse people well. So, for example, in Thailand, there's a cell phone app that's used for to help people know where busy areas are in the country, which I think is a really good response. And there are various management tools that protected area managers can use to look at the densities of people, so including the visitor use management framework out of America. And also, as I mentioned, there's some guidance coming out soon from the EU on how protected areas can open safely, with lots of examples and illustrations of different practices being done by different protected area authorities. But it really is important that the gateway communities are protected from receiving COVID-19, and that there's due consideration to those health concerns as things reopen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anna. I maybe slightly adjust this question to fit Mr. Carlo's point. You also a lot in the recommendation, especially policy, and you emphasis on the partnership and collaboration. And that is your recommendation to see this as a lesson learned for other countries in the region. What can we learn from building a good collaboration and partnership? Excuse me, Mr. Carlo, do you hear me? Or my connection is?
Yeah, okay. I think in responding to every disaster, such as the pandemic or earthquakes or tsunami, we have to be inclusive and does not only focus on particular group of people or discipline or communities. It must be inclusive because all people are creative human beings. Further, inclusive disaster response should be receptive and impactful, inspiring with a lot of stories, not only on Facebook, but at the same time on interactions with one another, and a truly realistic response, which needs to be communicated well. And it needs a lot of strategies in terms of communications, especially for countries like the Philippines, because communications is very hard. A receptive response means being sensitive to the needs of the peoples, to the needs of the rights of the people to live, and at all times it must be person-oriented, impactful, meaning the response should be efficient and effective, and at the same time implementable. And I think this is one challenges of our government here in the Philippines, because most of the plans are not translated into something that is smart, something simple and translatable into different strategies wherein people can easily follow and people can easily implement it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlo. My other question go to Dr. Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin, you mentioned about the backpacking and ecotourism, the links, and then you also, the component of ecotourism linked with learnings is part of the important component in ecotourism. But my question is that is backpacking or tourism in general a best context for environmental learnings?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's, in terms of something that people do on a reasonably regular basis, I think it can be very useful for environmental learning and increasing people's environmental knowledge in some instances, such as ecotourism or other areas of tourism that bring people into contact with the environment, at least explicitly. But there are many other ways to learn about the environment. Obviously, certain forms of work. If you're an ecotourist guide, that's another great way to learn about the environment. Farmers have an incredible amount of environmental knowledge. So tourism isn't the only way we can learn about the environment. But I think what it has going for it is that people like to do it. So it's something that appeals to a lot of people. So it could potentially be a fun way to learn about the environment. And I think that's also very important. Make it fun.
Okay, thank you very much for your insightful comment and feedback and observation on this. Because the time limit, I would like to quickly ask all the speakers before we finish what the key takeaway from this message. I would like to start from Benjamin first. Benjamin, what is your key takeaway message from this session before we finish?
I'm going to steal what Ben said. I think making learning fun is definitely the way to go. We will sit on many of these webinars. I think that's a real thing that we're going to have to improve how we communicate to really entertain as well and keep people engaged. And the same on issues of sustainability on ecotourism. Make it interesting and engaging. Thank you.
I guess I could add something.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Anna. The same question to Mr. Okay, yes, please.
I guess, yeah, to build on that point a bit more, you know, all sectors across the economy are going to have to come to terms with climate change, you know, sooner or later. And, you know, that's true for tourism as it is for any other industry. And I think hopefully ecotourism is one form of tourism that makes that more explicit than other forms of tourism. So potentially with ecotourism, we could get there a bit quicker than other forms of tourism. Potentially it has more to offer us as a society to start to take climate change seriously. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ben. The last point from Mr. Carlo, what is your key takeaway from this session, Mr. Carlo?
My takeaway is that shared opportunities is vital in combating our situations, whether we're in the pandemic or in whatever hardships we're in. At the same time, it is when we share opportunities, we are also empowering our communities, ourselves. And at the same time, we don't only connect, but at the same time, we invigorate our industry. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I think we would come to an end of this session. Before we finish, we would like to thank you very much for all our speakers, Dr. Anna especially, Ben Infantos, and also Mr. Carlo Ebios, for your insightful comments from different aspects of ecotourism, which we believe that is very important components and part of a very important agenda for recoveries. Participants for your time and interest, and then a conversation in the chat box. And maybe if you have further comment or question, please feel free to directly contact our speakers for further learning, further discussion and sharing. We would like to thank you very much for your time for this session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Satya.
Thank you.
Thanks,
very much.
everyone.
Thank you, Satya.
Thank you.
Shukran.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ban. Okay, thank you.
Bye.